You can essentially divide the region between two sets of players. You have the broadly speaking Western-aligned players, which essentially consist of Israel and the non-Islamist Arab countries, countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE. And then the other hand, you have the axis of Islamism, of support for Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, and jihadism. And that is the Iranian regime, of course. Turkey, unfortunately, under Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and Qatar being the lead financier of Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood.
Josh Hammer is Newsweek's senior editor-at-large and author of the new book, Israel and Civilization: The Fate of the Jewish Nation and the Destiny of the West. What does an America First foreign policy look like when it comes to Israel? How does Trump's Middle East strategy fit into it? And what of the U.S. relationship with Qatar?
America has always been engaged on the world stage. So the fact that we're not necessarily going to be around crusading in the name of spreading liberal democracy does not necessarily mean that we have no interest in the world. We're America first, but we have to be America smart as well.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek. Josh Hammer, so good to have you back on American Thought Leaders.
It's wonderful to be here. Thanks for having me again.
So I keep hearing about America First foreign policy, okay? Except that what that actually means to people spans such a wide range, it's almost unbelievable.
Yeah.
And so why don't we start there? Give me a picture of that and where you believe it lands.
Okay, so the right is obviously having a lot of foreign policy debates right now. And the Trump-era America First MAGA movement essentially arises out of a rejection of the status quo ante, of Bush-era neoconservatism, which we can vaguely define as a felt loyalty to abstract ideals, perhaps at the expense of the concrete national interest. So to kind of put some fine teeth on that, President Bush's second inaugural address, the so-called Freedom Agenda from January 2005, speaks in very grand terms about how human beings all throughout the world aspire to the same universal ends of Western liberalism, Locke, Jefferson, so forth there. And that philosophy, whatever its merits may be, had fairly ruinous results, I think, in many ways in practice. So the America First movement, I think, largely arises from a rejection of that. However, you're totally right there. The terminology America First really only goes so far. I mean, who is not America First, right? I mean, I'm America First, you're America First. I assume most people watching this are America First. I am someone who came of age in part in the post 9/11 era. 9/11, I was 12 years old. It was a huge turning point for me. And I, too, like many in this country, I was in middle school, to be clear, but I was initially a supporter of Bush-era policies when it comes to Iraq and Afghanistan. Like many, I fairly quickly sobered up from that. So I have been in kind of this murky middle between neoconservatism and isolationism, to use these kind of two overused terms, for my entire adult life there. So the America First movement, in many ways, was something that was welcome to me because I've been thinking and saying a lot of this for years. The devil is always, though, in the details. America First means that the American national interest is the sole and exclusive criterion for American foreign policy. That we're not going to have a foreign policy that is solely predicated upon trying to ally with democracies that act in a similar function to the Congress because of universalist ideas about free people there. And part of that is going to countenance alliances with countries that might not share our same moral or ethical foundations if they happen to, for instance, share our enemies. There's a little bit of kind of an enemy, my enemy is my friend sort of situation. So to kind of take the example of the Middle East, a realist foreign policy would be much more comfortable with an alliance with a country like Saudi Arabia, for instance, than a neoconservative foreign policy would be, because this is clearly a country that does not share our morals, ethics, background, values. I mean, they literally just allowed women to drive a few years ago, right? But in the Middle East, for instance, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and the Saudis are quite fearful of Iran. They don't want Iran to get a nuclear weapon there. So this is kind of the America First vision that I think President Trump in many ways has inaugurated. I think it's actually no accident, speaking of Saudi Arabia, that his first foreign trip in both 2017 and 2025 started in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. He's kind of making a firm declaration that this is my vision of realist foreign policy there. I think another element of America First is necessarily grappling with the fact that we live in an era where scarcity of resources is a real thing, that the era of America as the world's policeman, as it is said, is necessarily over. And we necessarily do have to focus this century on America's #1 gravest threat, which is China and the Chinese Communist Party. But as it pertains to the Middle East in particular, the relevant question then is, how can America best secure and protect its interests in this region while then prioritizing mid to long-term assets and military and all that into the Indo-Pacific to deal with China? The brilliant insight, I think, of President Trump during his first term, using this America First realist mentality, was that you would embolden your allies in the region to essentially protect and secure the region on both of your behalfs, because those allies then share your national interests. So Israel, for instance, is the state in the region, in this case, that shares pretty much all of America's core interests in the region there. You know, Hamas, Hezbollah, for instance, there. These are U.S. recognized foreign terrorist organizations there. So the realist prescription for the Middle East would be to essentially embolden your allies to kind of take care of this region, not necessarily by feeding off of the American teat, but simply by having leeway to more or less do their thing. And then that'll allow America in turn to kind of focus, at least over the next 20, 30 years, on its true grave challenge, which is China. What America First is not, to me, is being synonymous with this old kind of Fortress America mentality of simply kind of, you know, shrinking up like a hermit into its shell and pretending like the world does not exist. That's not America First. American foreign policy has never, ever truly acted like that. I mean, the Barbary Wars against the Barbary pirates off the coasts of Tripoli and Algiers, off the southern Mediterranean Sea, those are the second and third wars that we faced after the Revolutionary War against the British there in the early 1800s. I mean, the reason that Thomas Jefferson built up the United States Navy was in response to these Barbary Muslim pirates, actually, in the Mediterranean Sea. So America has always been engaged on the world stage. So the fact that we're not necessarily going to be around crusading in the name of spreading liberal democracy does not necessarily mean that we have no interests in the world. We're America first, but we have to be America smart as well.
So as you mentioned, the president's first trip was to the Middle East. And how do you analyze what happened there? Both, you know, what the president was trying to accomplish, but also what the countries he was visiting were trying to accomplish.
So, like 2017, his first trip begins in Saudi Arabia, and he has this big speech at the U.S.-Saudi Investment Forum, kind of calling for the formal end of the Bush era nation-building project there, which is correct. That project should be ended. You know, your mileage may vary as to whether or not this was the proper venue to do so. Saudi Arabia infamously was the sponsor of some of the 9/11 hijackers, but the country is very different now than it was back then. I mean, under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, this really is a very, very different Saudi Arabia. Look, under President Biden, who mollycoddled the Iranians, much like President Obama did before him, during the Biden presidency, the Chinese essentially tried to seize on this American, shooing to the side of the Arab Gulf states. The Chinese tried to come in and tried to make really firm inroads with the Saudis, with the Emiratis, try to bring them into the Belt and Road Initiative there. There was actually a major deal that the Saudis and the Chinese reached. I forgot the exact year, 2022, give or take, but kind of right in the midst of the Biden presidency there. So I think part of the geostrategic goal of this first Trump trip to the region was to peel back these moderate non-Islamist Arab states, countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, from the Chinese sphere of influence there. And then there's of course an economic portion here too. I mean, these dollar signs are insane, what these Arab countries are pledging to invest. We'll see what that looks like in practice. I mean, it's hard to say exactly, right, how exactly the steel worker in Western Pennsylvania or someone in Oklahoma will exactly tangibly benefit from this. Maybe. I mean, it's just hard to say. I mean, we'll see what that means in practice. But certainly that was part of this trip as well. But geopolitically, kind of peeling back the Saudis, Emiratis, so forth from Chinese sphere of influence, I think is part of the equation there. Now, here is where I think I see a little bit of a difference, and what frankly gives me a little bit of a pause for concern there. The first Trump administration's foreign policy, acting on this America First vision, I think recognized that at least sticking to the Middle East for a second, that you can essentially divide the region between two sets of players. You have the broadly speaking Western aligned players, which essentially consist of Israel and the non-Islamist Arab countries, countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE. And then on the other hand, you have the axis of Islamism, of support for Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, and jihadism. And that, these days, is mostly the Iranian regime, of course, Turkey, unfortunately, under Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and Qatar, Qatar being the lead financier of Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. I got a little worried on this trip, I'm being very candid with you, when the president really kind of rolled out the red carpet in Doha with the emir of Qatar. I think Qatar is actually a very problematic country there. Now, we'll see what happens. Maybe I might be missing part of the picture. It's possible that, that there are conversations behind the scenes that I'm not privy to. Perhaps President Trump is saying that in exchange, for this, you're going to stop doing all these sorts of bad things that you've been doing for years there. So it's a little too early to make judgments there, but I would just encourage, the president and his team to be focused on this Middle East foreign policy from the first administration that was really laser focused on emboldening your friends and punishing your enemies there, which I think kind of is one of the consummate ways that this America First vision plays out in practice. But overall, a lot to take away positive from this trip. By the way, Syria, taking away sanctions, maybe a little premature on the removal of sanctions, but there are reports that al-Jilani, who, let's be very clear, former al-Qaeda terrorist in Damascus, he's not let's be very clear who we're dealing with, but apparently they're having negotiations at some level about possibly normalizing ties with Israel, and that obviously would be a tremendous result if it's at all possible.
Right. Fascinating. Just a little bit on Qatar, there's a giant U.S. military base in Qatar. So I think for a lot of people, it's viewed as an ally.
Very, very complicated country, right? So this is a tiny, tiny country, first of all. We're talking here about 2.5, 3 million people at the most. A fraction of that are actually the native Arabs. We're talking here about 500,000 to 600,000 Arabs. The rest are these imported workers from Nepal and India there. But extravagantly wealthy country. Sits on one of the world's, if not the world's single largest natural gas field. Qatar lavishes money throughout the Western world. They've been doing this strategy for decades and decades. They also are very savvy. They make strategic investments. So Qatar actually owns, I forgot the exact percentage, but it's like 15 to 20%, maybe a little less than 10% of the Empire State Building. They're the number one foreign state investor into American universities since 9/11, literally number one, more than Russia, China, UK, France, Saudi Arabia, you name it, they're number one there, so they pour money there. But this is a country that likes to have it both ways. Yes, they host Al Udeid Air Base. That's America's largest air base in the region there.
And I believe they gifted that, didn't they?
They probably did, because again, this country has a lot of resources, and they allowed actually America to launch its strike that killed Qasem Soleimani from Al Udeid Air Base, which is actually quite notable. On the other hand, Al Jazeera is state-sponsored Qatari television, and when Donald Trump took office the first time back in 2017, the non-Islamist Arab countries, namely the Saudis, Emiratis, Bahrainis, and so forth, were so fed up with Qatar's sponsorship of the Muslim Brotherhood via Al Jazeera that they actually announced a diplomatic boycott of Qatar. So this is actually the GCC crisis, a major diplomatic crisis that Donald Trump walked into back in January of 2017. His instincts back then were to side with the Saudis and Emiratis against Qatar. That crisis ends up unwinding with no particular resolution. So, look, at best, this is a problematic country. At worst, it's worse than that. It's nefarious, but they do lavish a lot of money. They have a lot of money to throw around there, and my only thing would be, let's try to get some strings attached to this money. Let's try to make sure that in exchange for this there, you guys are going to focus on the good activities, less so on the bad activities.
Let's talk about Syria a little bit. It's a fascinating exploration, because I would have never guessed, say 6 months ago, that even the concept of having Syria somehow be involved in the Abraham Accords was even a possibility. And maybe we should actually talk about how the Abraham Accords fit into all this too.
Yeah. So Syria, look, if Syria were to make peace with Israel, that would be obviously a landmark thing. Syria has been one of Israel's foremost enemies since modern Israel was founded in 1948. I mean, without question. Literally ever since the Israeli war for independence against the invading Arab armies there, it was really Jordan, Egypt, Syria that led those initial wars. Whether it was 48, 67, 73, Syria has always been one of Israel's archest enemies. So if that were to actually happen, that would be a very, very, very big deal. having said that, let's be careful because of who we're dealing with here. I mean, this guy Al Jilani is kind of his adapted name there. He's essentially a puppet of Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey there. This is someone who was a peripatetic al-Qaeda terrorist for much of his life, kind of wandering across the region, taking up arms on behalf of al-Qaeda, al-Nusra Fund, various other Islamist outfits. At least at one point, the State Department had a pretty significant bounty on his head, if I'm not mistaken there. Now, is he a net improvement over Bashar al-Assad? Probably. I mean, the bounce of equities probably are in that camp. Assad was obviously a murderous tyrant and a horrific human being. I mean, gassing and killing over 500,000 of his own people, but arguably even more importantly for American strategic purposes, he was just a pure puppet of Vladimir Putin and the Ayatollah in Iran, which are, not friends of the United States. So geopolitically, it's probably a net improvement there. But let's be very, very careful who we're dealing with.
You've recently written a book about, Israel and civilization. So we have to talk about Israel. What is Israel's role in all of this, in your mind, from the perspective of an America First policy?
The key thing about Israel is that more than any of the other countries in the region, even the non-Islamist Arab countries, we share precisely the exact same enemies. Pretty much precisely. I mean, are they literally identical? Okay, fine. I mean, maybe not, right? I mean, maybe the Mexican drug cartels are more an enemy of the United States than Israel. But when it comes to the threat of jihadism and Islamism there, we're dealing with shockingly similar threats there. I'll give one very concrete example. So last year, at some point in the second half of the year, some decision was made to really start escalating and going after higher profile jihadi targets. So, for instance,
Israel made the decision.
Israel, yes.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, in late July in Tehran, Ismail Haniyeh, the head of Hamas, disappears while being in Tehran for a funeral. And around that same time, there was a major Lebanese Hezbollah jihadist by the name of Fuad Shakor who was assassinated as well. And then this culminates in the assassination, the bombing of Hassan Nasrallah, the decades-long head of Hezbollah, hiding in his bunker in Beirut, Lebanon, and then the death of Yahya Sinwar, the October 7th mastermind in southern Gaza. But Fuad Shakor, who I mentioned, and then there was another top-ranking Hezbollah commander by the name of Ibrahim Akil, who were both taken out by the IDF during this time span there. I like to focus oftentimes on Fuad Shakor and Ibrahim Akil because it's actually very instructive to the point I'm making here. So, who are Fuad Shakor and Ibrahim Akil? They are the masterminds, respectively, of the 1983 U.S. Marine barracks bombings that slaughtered 241 U.S. Marines, and of the U.S. Embassy bombing in Beirut the same year that killed 60 to 70 men. These two men, Shakor and Akil, had U.S. State Department bounties on their head of $5 to $7 million, respectively, for literally over 4 decades, from 1983 onwards, until the IDF took them out as part of this kind of Michael Corleone, Revenge in the Five Families style of reprisal in the year 2024. So to me, that's what America First looks like in practice there.
As we finish up, there's been these significant forays by the administration as a priority, the U.S. administration, into the Middle East. There's been, sort of rumors of some sort of disagreements between Netanyahu and Trump recently. What do you think is going to happen ultimately in the U.S.-Israel relationship?
Okay, so the first thing to note is, the rumors of a Trump-Netanyahu rift are just that. They are just rumors. It's very hard to try to sort fact from fiction. In fact, Brett Baer on Fox News literally asked President Trump about this point blank, and Trump dismissed it and said, no, Netanyahu was a very tough job. October 7th was one of the worst days, in the history of humanity. He's in a very difficult situation right now. So it's worth noting that the one time that I'm aware of that he's been explicitly asked about this possible rift point blank, he's emphatically denied it. Now, there is a slight history of Trump and Netanyahu butting heads. Let's recall that in November 2020, after the disputed election, Netanyahu did congratulate President Biden. In his defense, he didn't really have a choice. I mean, any foreign country has to be able to get along with the great country, the United States there, but President Trump was definitely upset about that after all that he had done to support Israel during his first administration there. It looked like that there was a rapprochement, that there was a real reconciliation. Over the past year and a half, Netanyahu went down to Mar-a-Lago. They had these the photo, smiling, thumbs up, and so forth there. So it's very hard to know. I think that what you're seeing play out with all these kind of unnamed sources and anonymous people leaking to the Washington Post, New York Times, and a lot of these articles, you're seeing a real-time rift in the Republican Party and in the administration when it comes to the view of Israel, of the U.S.-Israel relationship, and of Prime Minister Netanyahu as an individual. I think there were a lot of people in the broader Trump administration universe there who are probably not fans, actually, of Prime Minister Netanyahu there. Also, let's bear in mind that this second administration seems to be even more focused on the economic transactional part of international affairs and diplomacy than it probably was the first time around there. You know, I haven't necessarily seen a headline, you know, Israel pledges to commit, you know, $1 trillion. I'm making up a number, but that seems to be, thus far, the easiest way to kind of curry favor with the Trump administration is to just open up your checkbooks. Easier said than done when you're a country like Saudi Arabia or Qatar that has just extraordinary amounts, you know, of petroleum reserves necessarily. But look, I continue to be optimistic about U.S.-Israel relations, certainly under this administration. The longer-term threat, very much so, is the younger generation of Americans, where the polls show that the 30 and under category of Americans tend to be split, you know, roughly split 50-50 almost when it comes to who you support between Israel and Hamas. That's obviously deeply concerning there. But I would not be tremendously concerned when it comes to this particular administration. Ultimately, there are a lot of rumors flying around there. And, you know, look, the worst case scenario is that maybe President Trump says to Netanyahu, you know, you go be a little more independent. Not necessarily a bad thing. Israel should be more independent, frankly, of the United States there. I mean, that's kind of the whole purpose of Zionism, the term that we just defined there, is for the Jews to be in control themselves there without kind of listening, you know, to any great, you know, benevolent superpower like the United States or anyone else at all there. So that wouldn't necessarily be the end of the world. And the final thing that I'll say is, you know, Trump has also said a lot of things thus far in this second term that are shockingly pro-Israel or, you know, in a paradigm-shifting way. I mean, let's recall his February statement about the U.S. taking over Gaza. I mean, no one had that on the bingo card. Literally no one. And to be clear, I don't know if he means it. I don't even know what that means in practice there. You know, by talking about things like population transfer of Arabs, I mean, he's literally starting to sound, you know, like Rabbi Meir Kahane, this very right-wing rabbi whose party was banned by the Israeli Knesset for talking about this. So, I mean, Trump has said some shockingly, you know, pro-Israel things there. So it's a mixed bag. I think this kind of war in unnamed sources is just indicative of this broader rift in the party. The Republican Party, the MAGA movement, by and large, remains a pro-America, pro-Western civilization, pro-Israel movement. There are definitely real forces out there that are very critical. Trying to contain those forces was a large reason, frankly, why I wrote this book in the first place, Israel and Civilization there. So we'll see how it plays out. But, you know, despite the Qatar thing, which I'm less than thrilled about, I remain optimistic, albeit slightly more cautiously so than perhaps I would have been about a month or two ago.
Well, Josh Hammer, it's such a pleasure to have had you on.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.